In 1993, a Toyota engineer named Takeshi Uchiyamada sat through a design review where a supplier proposed cutting the wall thickness of an engine block, casting by 0.5 millimeter to save 4 cents per unit. The proposal was rejected in under 10 minutes, not because the part would fail. It wouldn't have. It was rejected because nobody in that room could prove it would still be perfect at 400,000 miles, and probably fine was not a standard anyone in that building was willing to sign their name to. That single meeting, repeated in some form thousands of times across a decade, is the forgotten reason 1990s Japanese engines refused to die. It wasn't one technology. It was an entire economic and cultural machine built to protect a number nobody could see on a spec sheet. The number of years an engine would run before it became somebody's problem. These are the 10 forces behind that machine. Number 10, lifetime employment, and the engineer who never left. In the American and European auto industry of the 1990s, engineers moved between companies constantly, chasing titles, chasing salary, chasing the next program. In Japan, the post-war corporate model was built around lifetime employment. An engineer who joined Toyota's powertrain division in 1975 was often still there in 1995, working on the third or fourth generation of the same engine family. That continuity mattered more than it sounds. A design flaw that surfaced in the field in 1982 wasn't just filed away in a report that a successor might never read. The same engineer who made the original decision was often still in the building, still accountable, still able to walk the mistake forward into the next design cycle personally. Institutional memory wasn't a database. It was a person who remembered exactly why a particular oil passage was shaped the way it was, because he'd been the one who redesigned it after a failure a decade earlier. Western manufacturers, cycling engineers through departments and companies every few years, were effectively relearning the same lessons over and over, sometimes making the same mistakes twice because the person who knew better had already moved on. Japanese engine programs compounded knowledge instead of losing it, and an engine designed by someone who has spent 20 years failing, fixing, and refining the same category of component behaves differently than one designed by a rotating cast of specialists, optimizing for their individual piece of the puzzle. Number 9, the supplier relationship nobody outside Japan understood. Western automakers treated parts suppliers as vendors, companies that competed on price every contract cycle, swapped out the moment a cheaper bit appeared. Japanese manufacturers built something closer to a family structure known as keiretsu, where a supplier might work exclusively with one automaker for generations. Denso didn't just sell Toyota fuel injectors. Denso and Toyota engineers sat in the same rooms, shared the same production philosophy, and were financially intertwined enough that a supplier's failure was the automaker's failure too. That changes incentives completely. A vendor competing on price every year has every reason to shave tolerances the moment nobody's looking. A supplier, locked into a decades-long relationship whose own survival depends on the automaker's reputation for reliability, has no such incentive. When Toyota's engineers specified a bearing tolerance, they weren't negotiating against a supplier trying to protect margin on a one-year contract. They were collaborating with a partner who would still be making that part in 15 years and would still be answering for it. Quality control under that structure wasn't an inspection step at the end of the line. It was baked into a relationship that had no expiration date. Number 8, the Japanese industrial standards obsession with material traceability. Every batch of steel, every casting, every forged component that went into a 1990s Japanese engine could be traced back to the specific furnace run and the specific inspection record that certified it. This wasn't unique to the auto industry. JS, the Japanese industrial standards system, demanded documentation rigor that bordered on obsessive across Japanese manufacturing broadly. What that meant for engines, specifically, was that a metallurgical inconsistency in a batch of connecting rod forgings could be identified, traced, and quarantined before a single defective part reached an assembly line. American and European quality systems of the same era relied more heavily on statistical sampling, testing a percentage of parts and assuming the rest matched. Japanese engine plants tested closer to the full run, and when they didn't, the traceability meant a field failure could be traced back to an exact production date and an exact material batch within days, not months. The forgotten cost of that system was time and money that showed up nowhere on a horsepower figure or a brochure. The forgotten benefit was that a crankshaft forged in a Japanese plant in 1994 had a documented pedigree that made silent, mystery material defects almost impossible to hide. Number 7, warranty periods that were actually short. This sounds backwards, but it's real. Japanese automakers in the 1990s often offered shorter formal warranty periods than their American competitors. Sometimes just 36,000 miles on the powertrain compared to 100,000-mile warranties. American brands began advertising in the 2000s to compensate for declining build quality. A short warranty sounds like a company protecting itself from liability. In practice, it forced something different. When the manufacturer isn't contractually on the hook to fix an engine at 90,000 miles, the entire burden of long-term reliability sits on the reputation of the brand itself, not on the fine print of a warranty document. And reputation, unlike a warranty claim, doesn't have an expiration date. Toyota and Honda in the 1990s couldn't hide behind, well, it's out of warranty, the way a longer warranty brand implicitly could, because their entire market position depended on word-of-mouth reliability that stretched 15 and 20 years past any warranty period. The absence of a long formal warranty meant engineers weren't designing to survive a specific mileage number. They were designing to survive indefinitely, because indefinite survival was the actual product being sold. Number 6, the used car export economy created a second reputational market. Domestically, Japan's strict vehicle inspection requirements pushed owners to retire cars early, and those low-mileage vehicles flooded export markets across Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Australia. What that created was a second, almost invisible reputational battlefield. A Toyota engine that failed at 150,000 miles in a taxi fleet in Lagos, or a work truck in rural Australia, would generate word-of-mouth damage in markets where Toyota was fighting for dominance against cheaper, less established competitors. Japanese manufacturers were effectively being reliability tested twice, once in the demanding but relatively gentle Japanese domestic market, and again in brutal, high-mileage, poorly maintained conditions overseas, where any weakness in the design would surface fast and spread through communities that relied on word-of-mouth far more than advertising. An engine had to survive being driven hard, maintained inconsistently, and run in extreme heat by someone who might never change the oil on schedule. That second market, largely invisible to Western observers at the time, quietly forced a level of durability margin that the domestic market alone wouldn't have demanded. Number 5, the deliberate rejection of the horsepower arms race. European manufacturers spent the 1990s locked in a specific output war, extracting maximum horsepower per liter through higher compression, more aggressive cam timing, and tighter margins between what an engine could produce and what it could survive producing. Japanese manufacturers, particularly on their mainstream passenger car lines, largely opted out of that competition. The Toyota Camry 4-cylinder in 1996 wasn't trying to outpower anything. It was tuned conservatively, running well below the theoretical limits of its own architecture, trading bragging rights on a spec sheet for margin that showed up nowhere except in a bearing that never wore out. This wasn't a failure of ambition. Honda proved with VTEC that Japanese engineers could chase performance when they wanted to. It was a deliberate business decision that the mainstream volume seller, the Camry, the Accord, the Corolla, needed to survive decades of ownership by people who would never track their oil changes precisely. And that decision meant leaving power on the table in exchange for a margin nobody could see until the engine was still running at 300,000 miles, while a competitor's equivalent had already been rebuilt twice. Number 4, corrosion protection standards built for a climate that demanded it. Japan is humid, coastal, and subject to intense seasonal moisture, conditions that accelerate corrosion in ways that drier American markets don't experience uniformly. Japanese manufacturers built corrosion resistance into engine components at a level that exceeded what most of their export markets actually required, because they had no choice domestically. Galvanized fasteners, corrosion-resistant coatings on internal components exposed to condensation, gasket materials chosen for resistance to moisture cycling, all of it was engineered first for a home market that would punish weakness immediately and visibly. When those same engines were exported to drier climates in the American Midwest or the Australian outback, they arrived over-engineered for a threat that barely existed there, which meant the corrosion-related failures that quietly killed less carefully protected engines in humid American coastal regions or salted northeastern winters simply didn't happen at the same rate. A design margin built for Yokohama's summer humidity became an invisible gift to an owner in Phoenix who never once thought about corrosion. Number 3, the end and cord and a shop floor culture of stopping, not shipping. Any single worker on a Japanese engine assembly line in this era had the authority to physically halt production the moment something looked wrong, using a signal system called andon. That authority sounds like a minor procedural detail. Its actual effect was to invert the entire incentive structure of a factory. In a production system where stopping the line is expensive and workers are punished or pressured for causing delays, small defects get waved through because nobody wants to be the person who cost the plant an hour of output. In a system where any worker is empowered and expected to stop the line, small defects get caught before they become a shipped engine, and more importantly, they get investigated for root cause rather than just patched and moved past. The cumulative effect over a decade of a production philosophy that treated every defect as information rather than an inconvenience was a manufacturing tolerance that tightened continuously, year over year, without a single dramatic redesign. Nobody could point to one meeting where reliability jumped. It happened in 10,000 small corrections that a Western production model, optimized around throughput and cost per unit, structurally couldn't replicate. Number 2, an accounting culture that measured decades, not fiscal quarters. Western automakers in the 1990s were increasingly beholden to public shareholders demanding quarterly performance, a structure that inherently rewards decisions that improve this year's margin, even if they cost something 10 years down the road. Japanese corporate governance of the era, with cross-shareholding structures, bank-centered financing, and less exposure to activist shareholders demanding immediate returns, gave engineering divisions room to make decisions that wouldn't pay off for a decade. Overbuilding a bearing surface, adding a redundant cooling passage, specifying a more expensive alloy, none of these decisions improved next quarter's earnings. All of them improved an engine's chances of still running in 2015. A management structure insulated from short-term shareholder pressure could afford to fund an engineering culture obsessed with a 20-year outcome, because nobody influential enough to override that decision was measuring success in 90-day increments. Number 1, reliability was the actual product, not a feature of the product. Every other item on this list is a mechanism. This is the reason the mechanisms existed at all. Western automakers in the 1990s were selling horsepower, styling, brand prestige, and technology. Reliability was a feature that showed up in a J.D. Power survey, one data point among many that a marketing department could highlight or downplay depending on the year. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Toyota and Honda, had built their entire market identity, especially in export markets where they were still establishing themselves against entrenched domestic competitors, around a single promise: this car will still be running long after everything else on the lot has failed. That promise wasn't a marketing slogan bolted onto the car after it was built. It was the design brief itself, handed to engineers before a single component was drawn. Every decision on this list, the lifetime employed engineer who remembered every past failure, the supplier locked into a permanent relationship, the traceable steel, the short warranty that forced accountability through reputation instead of paperwork, the export market quietly testing durability in brutal conditions, the deliberate refusal to chase horsepower, the corrosion protection built for a punishing home climate, the andon cord that treated every defect as unacceptable, the shareholder structure that funded decade-long thinking, all of it existed to protect one asset: the belief, held by millions of owners who never read a single engineering report, that a Japanese engine from this era simply did not break. That belief is why a Camry with 280,000 miles on it still sells for real money today, and it's why the forgotten reason those engines lasted 500,000 miles was never really about the metal at all. It was about a company that decided, at every level from the factory floor to the boardroom, that an engine's reputation 30 years later mattered more than anything that could be measured this quarter. Nobody builds that way by accident, and increasingly, nobody builds that way at all. If this kind of engineering history is what you come here for, the next video breaks down exactly how modern cost pressures unraveled that same philosophy one decision at a time.